Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Richard Horowitz, and I am the co-host of the Dr. Talk Healing Lyme Summit 2.0. It is my great pleasure today to introduce to you Jeff Zhao, who is heading up 60 Degrees Pharmaceutical. And we're going to discuss today Babesia and Aracota Tafenoquine for the treatment of Babesia with the new clinical trial that's going on and some of the prior history of using it for malaria prevention. So, Jeff, I really appreciate your getting on today because Babesia is a really big problem in my practice. And I know in a lot of the Lyme patients' worlds, we're seeing it all the time. So, thank you for joining us.
Oh, no worries, Dr. Horowitz. It's really great to be with you here today, and hopefully I can shed some light on all things Tafenoquine and in various aspects.
Yeah, so tell people, how exactly did you get into the science world and kind of head up 60 Degrees Pharmaceutical? What's your background and how did you get into this?
My family's in the mining industry originally, so I traveled around a lot as a kid, including to some places, tropical places with a lot of income and health inequality, and that sort of exposed me to tropical diseases a little bit. And so as a science student and eventually a PhD candidate, I became interested in malaria and drug discovery. And when I was finished with grad school in Australia, that led me to a Walter Reed Army Institute of Research in Washington, D.C., where I worked on tafenoquine for malaria in various aspects before founding 60 Degrees Pharma in about 2010, so like almost 15 years ago.
Well, your timing was great because I think a lot of people know my story, but I was the first doctor to diagnose babesiosis in the Hudson Valley, New York, going back into the 1990s. And the case that led this to me was this woman in a wheelchair she couldn't walk for 5 years, basically paralyzed for the waist down, and had these drenching sweats in her 30s, and we had done a differential diagnosis, and we ruled out malaria, hyperthyroidism, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, tuberculosis, autoimmune. We went through everything, and we were not supposed to have Babesia in our area. So we ultimately took her blood. We sent out the ticks from our area in the Hudson Valley. We found, in fact, that a few percentage of them did have Babesia. She ended up being positive by PCR in the blood for Babesia microti. We, at the time, Mepron, azithromax, atovaquone, and azithromycin worked. These were the good old days when the drugs for, this disease worked. And lo and behold, within the weeks to months later, she walked out of the wheelchair. I mean, the woman is skiing at this point, and it was
Uh,
primarily treating Babesia, right? So I got an early on kind of take of like how important this parasite is, that, it's not just giving you day sweats and night sweats and chills and making you tired. I mean, this thing can destroy people's lives. This woman was so sick she couldn't even get out of a wheelchair. So years ago, the drugs worked. I had published, even abstracts on mefloquine, right, a precursor to tafenoquine, years ago, because I was finding clindamycin and quinine and atovaquone and azithromycin stopped working. And this goes back even 20 years ago. So I'm really happy that you started working on this around 2010 because, boy, there's a big need in the clinical space for drugs that hit these malarial type parasites.
Particularly in patients who have long-standing infections that, aren't responsive to other things. Um, you know, in the anecdotal interactions we have with physicians and patients, we hear about that all the time. So we're doing what we can to help.
Yes. And with malaria being, I don't think people realize like how severe malaria is in the world. I know they've tried to develop vaccines which have had some efficacy, still not great, but I mean there's like millions and millions of people that still die, right, every year from malaria. So, to create a drug that's effective for malaria prevention, when I went to India years ago, I'm pretty sure, in fact, I was taking a mefloquine once a week or something because I've gone to India many times, right, and Thailand and other places. So I understand that you were in these other countries, you were seeing the need, and how did it come about that this drug discovery actually happened?
Yeah, so the army coming out of the Korean War um, had successfully gotten primaquine, which was the original aminoglycinine precursor to tafenoquine, approved for the radical cure of vivax malaria. And vivax malaria has a quiescent liver stage which reactivates and causes relapse. And aminoglycinines like primaquine and tafenoquine are uniquely active against that particular stage of the parasite. The problem with primaquine is its half-life is only 6 hours. And unless you take it religiously as prescribed by the CDC, then if you're exposed to malaria, you will contract it. And so what the army was trying to do was develop a long half-life version of primaquine. And they started in 1978. And then by the time 60 Degrees was in a position to license the Army's data and begin a public-private partnership with them over several years, it had been almost 30 years or 35 years in development before our involvement in that project. So we partnered with them in 2015. And then our role was to complete a couple of clinical trials, put the dossier together with a lot of help from other partners. And we were successful in getting Tafenoquine approved for weekly prophylaxis of malaria for up to 6 months in 2018. And that was the original indication and commercial purpose for developing Tafenoquine.
Got it. So if someone like myself, who I haven't traveled in a while, COVID kind of put a kibosh on it, but in the past, I've been to Thailand, I've been to India, I've traveled a lot in malaria places, and they would talk about doxycycline prophylactically, or Malarone, atovaquone, proguanil, or mefloquine. So this is now pretty much standard of care. Like if I was now going to go to India or Thailand or a place where it has malaria, the dosage, this would be basically, I would be taking Tafenoquine basically once a week.
Yeah, so the approved dose for malaria prevention is a weekly, sorry, a loading dose over 3 days, 200 milligrams a day for 3 days, and then 200 milligrams once a week during travel for up to 6 months. And then subsequently, we've also generated safety data that have proven out the safety profile for up to a year. Arecota offers a couple of benefits over the alternative medications you mentioned. One is once weekly, which is really nice for patients who have trouble remembering to take their medications. I'm one of those folks, so I certainly appreciate the option of a once weekly regimen. And then the other advantage is when you get back, you don't have to do any post-exposure prophylaxis apart from one dose. And that's because of the 2-week half-life of Tafenoquine and the fact that it kills those quiescent liver stages that I was talking about. But
Hmm.
as far as we know, unlike with mefloquine and atovaquone, there's no drug resistance been reported really for acetaminophenolines in general. And so that's another benefit that Arecota has for malaria prevention.
Hmm. And the mechanism of action, from what I've understood, it's oxidative stress against the parasite. Is that one of the major mechanisms of how it's working?
Yeah, that seems to be the non-clinical work that's been published seems to indicate an activation to oxidative intermediates intracellularly, and then that generates hydrogen peroxide radicals, which kill the parasites in very specific locations. So in the liver, in the blood, in the red blood cells, and in the bone marrow for the gametocytes of Plasmodium falciparum.
Right. And, regarding that, I mean, that's been, I think, one of the big questions for Lyme patients for years, because I would say on the average, it's at least 80% of my patients who have Babesia. I mean, it's been higher. In the studies I have published in the literature, it's varied somewhere between 60 and 80. But I can tell you over time, it's at some point, it's almost everybody who comes into my practice who's chronically ill who has it. Do we know, just like malaria, when it has the phase in the liver that it hides in bone marrow, do we know exactly where this parasite is hiding? Because there's been theories about it, but I've never seen anything that's been absolutely like convinced me as to where it's hiding and why it's relapsing.
Well, I don't know where it's hiding, and I've read a few papers, and I've talked to other people who are much smarter than me on the basic biology of Babesia and um, in these long-term infections. I don't think there's much in the scientific literature about, is there a quiescent stage the way that there is recognized for Plasmodium vivax malaria and even Plasmodium malariae, which recrudesces from a quiescent blood stage parasite. The biology seems to be much more advanced and understood for malaria than it is for babesiosis and how babesiosis infections reactivate.
Right. Although we know, like the Red Cross, when people give blood in Connecticut, they know that they're finding, right, they will find Babesia microti in the blood of people who are pretty much asymptomatic, right? They have to screen them very carefully, right? By
Yeah,
PCR.
and some of those DNA positive cases can last for a year or more, um, and that's beyond the point where red blood cells. The half-life of a red blood cell is 120 days.
Yes.
So what is happening after day 120 in patients with PCR positive infection, but no symptoms?
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, because we see recrudescence all the time in our patients. We have patients, for example, I will treat them with 9 weeks of dapsone combination therapy for Lyme, and their Babesia is quiescent. I just had a patient like this, and they'll be okay actually for a couple of months, and all of a sudden they'll start getting symptoms, and we'll get a Babesia fish that's positive. And it's not the first time we've seen this. That sometimes we knock down the load of certain infections, and it comes out, but it's clearly a big problem. And for those of you who are listening, I'm speaking with Jeff Dow from 60 Degrees Farmer. We're talking about our code at Tafenoquine, which we're going to talk about the clinical trial that's ongoing now for Babesia. I think you just, in fact, I saw it in the literature. You just signed up the first patient. I think was it a couple of weeks ago? Um, it,
Yeah, so you know, one of the nice things that's happened over the last few years is there has been a lot of basic research done with tafenoquine in various animal models, and those non-clinical studies seem to suggest that tafenoquine is active against various kinds of Babesia parasites in both animals with normal immune systems and animals with compromised immune systems. And if the drug is given for long enough in those animal models, it confers a sterile protection. Now, animal models aren't humans, and every scientist will tell you that you can't predict human disease based on mice. Um, but the good news is that there are some case series beginning to come out, and in particular, the one from Yale that was published in June of last year, which showed in 5 immunosuppressed patients given tafenoquine with a loading dose and then once a week for at least 6 weeks, in combination with standard of care medications, led to cure in 80% of patients who had previously failed multiple rounds of standard of care medications. So anecdotal studies like that are obviously a bias because of the publication bias towards positive results and data, but they are suggestive of a potential role that tafenoquine might play. And so our clinical program is really designed to replicate those findings and provide the data to hopefully go to FDA and seek some label modifications to allow tafenoquine to be prescribed in various kinds of babesiosis. So we have actually 3 clinical trials that are either ongoing or planned. So one of them is a study in severe babesiosis amongst hospitalized patients. So that's a randomized study that we're doing at Yale, Rhode Island Hospital, one of the Harvard sites, and Tufts. And we've enrolled 6 patients out of a target 33, and we expect to be finished with that study by the end of the 2025 tick season. The study you mentioned is a open label study under an expanded access route for patients who are immunosuppressed and have failed prior medications. And we're providing the tafenoquine on a compassionate use basis and then collecting some data to support hopefully that future FDA interaction. And then the study we're working on in the planning phases for at the moment is a study in chronic babesiosis, where there's clinical symptoms of babesiosis and some laboratory evidence of infection, and that's designed to try and collect evidence and data to reflect the patient experience that perhaps some of your patients are more familiar with, and again, so that we can kind of standardize the information and provide that to physicians and the regulatory agencies.
Yeah. Well, Tom Moorcroft and I we did a talk that will be aired actually shortly about tafenoquine and about different Babesia treatments. And, we're both finding, and again, we're not talking about FDA, when we talk about your company, I'm talking about my personal experience and Tom's, is that it's at least an 80% success rate because we can't really use any of the older drugs anymore. They really just don't work in our patients. Now, are our patients immunocompromised? The answer is yes, some of them are. Lyman-Bartonella patients, a lot of them do have a problem with immunocompromise. Their immunoglobulin G levels are low, their subclasses are low. Some have had long COVID, they have T cell exhaustion. So, in a sense, a lot of our patients are immunocompromised. And we have used the loading dose of tafenoquine at 200 a day, 3 days in a row, once a week for 6 weeks. Not standardized the way you've done it, but some patients I may have given Malarone with it, some Atovaquone Zithromax, because we didn't know early on how effective. But I can tell you that in my experience and Tom's, we have not published this. This is just, we're talking about our clinical experience now. It's at least an 80% success rate, probably higher, that we're seeing at this point. And what I really liked about it is we're not really seeing a lot of the side effects. When I do Dapsone, one of the major side effects of Dapsone is elevated methemoglobin levels, where you don't carry oxygen well in the blood, and you get anemia with hemolysis. And I've been able to minimize it somewhat, very high dose folic acid to block that effect with Dapsone using methylene blue. The nice part is that when I follow methemoglobin levels and I follow counts, I might see a little bit of anemia, or I might see a little bit of methemoglobin, but people seem to tolerate it extremely well. So for me, at least, it's very promising. And it's important because it's not just from a tick bite. I published a case several years ago of a woman from Europe who had 4 pregnancies in a row, and 2 of them, she reactivated her Babesia in the 3rd trimester. The child could have had hemolysis with jaundice at birth. At that point, we gave her clindamycin, atovaquone, Zithromax, and the children were fine. But it's a big problem because you're getting it in the blood supply, you're getting it from maternal fetal transmission, and even organ transplantation. So people can get Babesia from many different sources. Now, using it in pregnancy, it's at this point, it's not a drug that can be used in pregnancy. Is that correct?
Yeah, tafenoquine is contraindicated in pregnancy, and the reason for that is there isn't any way of testing the G6PD status of a fetus.
Yeah.
So even though it's not a likely, well, I can't really comment on whether it's a likely or not a likely risk. It's just a fact that it's extremely difficult to obtain a fetal blood sample and therefore definitively know that someone doesn't have G6PD deficiency. And there's no way to predict it based on the G6PD status of the mother or the father. So that's the main reason for the contraindication in pregnancy for tafenoquine and primaquine.
Right.
And I hope you do publish your experience with tafenoquine in chronic disease, because people need to hear that, and it's so much easier to have a conversation about things more broadly when something's in the medical literature and gone through all the hoops. So
Yeah,
I'd encourage you to get that out there if you can.
No, I will. I promised my wife, because I've pretty much been publishing every year, and I'm starting to just pull back a little bit. In fact, we just submitted last week for an NIH grant for a planning phase, an R34 planning phase for a randomized multicenter placebo-controlled Dapsone trial for the treatment of chronic Lyme/PTLDS. So that just got submitted last week. And I can tell you, and God bless you for doing these trials. I had no idea what it was like trying to get NIH grants, like what you have to go through just to be able to submit and get these trials done. So I was in the midst of that, but I will look at the data this year. I may have a little bit of time. I'm working on a book right now for Simon and Schuster, and get a whole case series of people who have taken Aracoda Tafenoquine at this point. The difference will be, of course, with our series is we weren't sure. I needed to make sure the patients got better, so a lot of times we were mixing it with atovaquone and azithromycin or Malarone. I may have some patients who've taken it alone, but odds are, I think, in the way we did it, because I just wanted it to be a home run out of the park. I didn't want to take a chance. A lot of these people were taking artemisinin, in which, again, with malaria, it's now become resistant, but they were also doing like Chinese skull cup, Japanese knotweed, a cornea. They were doing other types of herbs that have been shown to be effective in, like, for example, Babesia duncani. So we were kind of doing the kitchen sink approach, knowing it was safe, not as scientific, like we don't have randomized trials, but I can tell you nevertheless, patients who had failed a lot of the prior protocols, who were fish positive, RNA positive in the blood, who I could not get rid of it. We have definitely had some successes using it, and I will try and get that published as long as my wife gives me permission to go through the data. You probably know at some point you've got to get your wife's permission after 30 years of marriage to get some of this stuff out there. But yes, I will definitely look at it.
I think you learn what your responsibilities are easily the older you get on that front. And congratulations on getting the NIH grant submitted.
Yeah,
It's
it's just
short.
a
It's
shame.
a
It takes a long time, by the way. We don't hear
yes,
back for like a year.
yes,
And then we
yeah,
have to
and
get the statistician. I mean, it's a very long process. So I don't think people realize, like, the trials you're doing right now, it's a lot of legwork to be able to get this done. And I really applaud you and your company for doing it. And at least from my experience, I think you're going to have a home run. I think from at least the preliminary data, not speaking from FDA or anything else, my personal experience, I do think you're going to have a home run on your hand based on what I've been seeing.
well, thanks for the encouragement, and we'll see how the trials go, and um, hopefully we get a receptive regulator at the end if the trends we hope to see pan out.
Yes. So if people want to find out more about the trials, you said there one of them is open label. If people want to find out more about it or get more information on tafenoquine and you and what you're doing, how do they contact you? Where do they get that information from at this point?
So we have a link on our website. So it's www.60degreespharma.com. There's a clinical pipeline tab, and then there's a button to click, which will give you more information on the clinical trial program for babesiosis. Um, many companies have inquired, and our inquiries line is inquiries at 60degreespharma.com. And every company has one of those, but we actually answer the emails relatively responsively. And then I'm obligated to share that on our product website, which is aracoda.com, there is obviously the important safety information for prescribing for malaria, but also contact numbers if you need to call about adverse events or medical issues related to the product.
That's great. That's great. No, I think, look, it's a very important medication you've been working on. I didn't realize you've been working on this since 2010, and it came out of the Army research. I think it's fabulous when you get these private public partnerships that, are going on this way. I think it's fabulous. So any other information you think that people should know about Aracoda as far as the trial, side effects, efficacy, anything else you think would be important to share with the public?
So we've been to a number of conferences focused on tick-borne disease, and what we sort of emphasize two things. One is the clinical trial program and our commitment to generating data to validate patient experience and inform, the regulatory process. I think the other thing is just highlighting the importance of getting the most relevant and up-to-date safety information. And there are two places you can get that. One is the product website, aracoda.com, and that's the synthesis of the FDA's advice related to safety in the context of malaria prevention. And then the other important place is a publication that we put out in 2022 in Travel Medicine and Infectious Disease. It's by Novit Moreno et al. And that documents it's a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial comparing weekly tafenoquine following a loading dose to placebo for 12 months, continuous dosing. And we looked at ophthalmologic safety, psychiatric safety, as well as did a lot of routine clinical chem, CBC, and routine adverse event reporting at regular intervals throughout the study. And, overall, it reinforced the known drug-related adverse events that have been described for acetaminophen, such as a small increase in methemoglobinemia that resolves, small predictable changes in or decreases in hemoglobin that resolve over time. And these are folks have been screened for G6PD deficiency. And then it helped to dispel some of the myths about psychiatric risks associated with quinolin antimalarials, because we did baseline psychiatric exams and followed various psychiatric inventories throughout the study. And they suggest that in the context we use, where the label was followed, the risk of psychiatric adverse events was no more than placebo, even in patients with prior medical history, provided the label's followed the way it's supposed to be.
Right. And for those who don't, the history of drug development with malaria babesia, the reason this was coming out is because mefloquine lariam, which, by the way, I've used easily, I'm not exaggerating the numbers, over 1,000 doses easily, 1,000 patient experiences over 30 something years, because that was, very long half-life. But the difference is it was affecting the QT interval. I had to make sure people were off all QT drugs, but there was a black box warning because I guess vets came back, years ago with psychiatric trauma, took this with the load. I've learned over time, when I had to kind of play around with these drugs years ago, when I was searching for answers for Babesia, that we did not find that we ended up seeing those kind of psychiatric side effects. And eventually, of course, they took off the label. But that's, of course, why you had to do that, is because it was like a cousin of one of the drugs that was out there in the past. But yes, I agree. It seems to be, at least from our experience, extremely well tolerated. Again, personal experience, not your company's experience. We've really not seen any problems with it. And in our patients, they're very complicated, because my patients are not straight Babesia. My patients are Lyme and Bartonella that do have psychiatric issues, and we have not seen it. It seems to be very well tolerated in our patient population. So again, I wish you well in this. Thank God you've been doing the work on this, and I think you're going to find that it's going to be quite effective when you get the final results of the clinical trial. And I will speak to my wife about going through those case studies to see if I can get a few of them in the medical literature.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that paper and seeing you at the next conference.
I appreciate it. So thank you again for joining us today, Jeff. It was a real pleasure speaking to you and letting people know about Aracona Tafenoquine and some of the trials you're doing for Babesia. So for those again who've been tuning in, my name is Dr. Richard Horowitz. I'm the co-host of the Dr. Talk Healing Lyme Summit 2.0. We've been speaking to Jeff Dow from 6 Degrees Pharmaceutical, really about an important topic, Babesia, and some of the treatments that we're looking at right now to help a lot of our suffering patients who have this malarial type parasite. So thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to seeing everyone soon in the near future. Thank you.